one thing you did mention a little bit earlier was that there was no evidence that King John was actually literate, that he could sign these documents. And that's not uncommon. It's certainly not a thing for England, because a lot of the world was unable to read or write back then. If you go back to the Egyptian kings and before that, one of the biggest concerns was that their scribes were having communications with each other against the wishes of the king. But what I really want to get at is modern politicians, they are literate. They're some of the most educated politicians we've ever had, and yet the policies that they're making are some of the most woeful economic and libertarian policies we've ever seen. In fact, they're totalitarian. Are you dismayed to see that back then there were good policies being made by illiterate kings, and now we've got literate kings writing terrible policy?
Well, I think you've summed up a lot of the problem with our politicians today. And it hasn't always been the case. What we have in the Australian Parliament, for example, the federal parliament, I'd argue is a parliament of lawyers. I have a legal background. The very last person you want to hand a law over to or a contract to is a lawyer, because they will always make it more complicated than it needs to be. They will always add detail. They will always look for loopholes. But what the Magna Carta does is it sets out some really important principles. So while people might not know, or if they know the Magna Carta, might not know the details of all 63 chapters, and some of the chapters are pretty esoteric, they would have a rough idea about this principle that taxes can't be levied without the permission of the people in some way. And we lose the idea that principles are important. So for someone like me growing up, a Ronald Reagan who explained something simply, who didn't overcomplicate the situation, and who said, well, look, as complex as some things might be, there are key principles that we need to understand. And again, when you look at the world around us today, the politician who, for me, sums that up and infuriates the left is someone like Donald Trump, who speaks in principle, who speaks, sometimes misspeaks, but who captures an essence of something that the lawyers in Parliament want to sometimes neglect, forget about and ignore. And again, that's the power of the Magna Carta. You don't need to know Latin, and King John was speaking French to the barons. You don't need to know French. You don't need to know 800 years of British history to understand there's something really important about this idea that citizens have rights.
The goddamn French, they're in everything. You know, I actually saw Jonathan Sumption describe our English and French history as a history of siblings, because it's so deeply intertwined. You can't explain English history without looking at French history. But that's a different topic altogether. Now, there's a lot of rebellion against taxation at the moment, and I'm feeling pretty aggressively hostile toward the government, knowing I have to hand over so much money to a regime that might very well turn around and gift it to a foreign terrorist organisation. Now, your book details the great tax revolts of the ancient world, and I feel like leading another one of those, and I'm sure I'm not alone. But originally, tax was meant to be an exchange of powers, the power to take from the people while the people take a measure of power from the king. John, taxation is not unique to Britain, it's not unique to the West, and it's existed long before the Magna Carta. Why is the Magna Carta's tax system different from the others? Was it because it constrained the power of the kings? Because I know a lot of other monarchies in the world, they never restrained their power.
It was significant because it acknowledged something that had been understood and talked about but hadn't been written down in the way that the Magna Carta did, that if the king is going to tax the people, the king must have their permission. Now, this was absolutely revolutionary, because the idea that kings were appointed by God or even were godlike themselves was so significant in human history. But for the first time in the Magna Carta, we have a view that the ruler and the ruled must work in cooperation and in collaboration. So there might be debates about how much tax the government takes. There might be debates about what the government spends the money on. But it was an acknowledgement that citizens have rights and they can't be invaded. And this was why the Magna Carta became so important in the English Civil War, as King Charles was imposing a whole host of excise taxes, of income taxes effectively on the people. And they said, but we have never agreed to this. And you can take this further and you can apply it to democracy as a whole. In a democracy, ideally, we have the right to vote. Sometimes we will get elected those who we don't vote for, but it still means we have the ability to participate in the process, and that makes it legitimate. Similarly, the idea of the Magna Carta is that if the people allow the king permission to tax, it somehow makes it legitimate and it makes it allowable. That's, again, one of the great insights of the Magna Carta.